The air in the small office off the kitchen at Graceland was always still, heavy with the scent of old paper, stale cigar smoke, and quiet authority. Here, amidst the whirlwind of fame that was Elvis Presley, sat the calm, unmoving eye of the storm, his father, Vernon Presley. It is a little-known fact that in the final, spiraling years of the king's life, Vernon was paid an annual salary of over $75,000, the equivalent of more than $350,000 today. Not just to manage the books, but to personally approve every single expense. Nothing moved without his signature. Not a dollar for a new Cadillac, not a dime for the grocery bill, and not a single cent for the endless, cascading river of pharmaceuticals. So when the checks written to the doctors and the pharmacies, checks for staggering quantities of prescription drugs, crossed his desk day after day, signed in his son's increasingly shaky hand, was the man who held the purse strings simply a grieving father, powerless to stop the fall, or was he the silent, complicit architect of it? To understand the silence of Vernon Presley, you must first understand the noise of his past. He was a man forged in the crucible of the Great Depression, born into a world of dirt-poor sharecropping in Tupelo, Mississippi, where survival was a daily, grinding battle. Poverty wasn't an abstract concept to Vernon. It was a physical presence, a cold ghost that haunted his every decision. It was this ghost that led him, in 1938, to alter a $4 check from his landlord. A desperate act for a desperate man, trying to feed his wife, Gladys, and his young son, Elvis. The cost was catastrophic. For those $4, Vernon Presley was sentenced to 3 years in the Mississippi State Penitentiary. Parchman Farm, a name that was a synonym for hell on earth. While he labored under the brutal Mississippi sun, it was Gladys who kept the family alive, who protected their boy, who instilled in Elvis a fierce, almost suffocating love for his mother and a deep, abiding fear for his father's well-being. When Vernon was released after just 8 months, he returned a changed man. The shame of Parchman, the terror of poverty, it branded him. He became quiet, watchful, and obsessed with one thing above all else: financial security. He vowed to never be powerless again, and as his son's voice began to echo from every radio in America, Vernon saw his chance. He would not be the father. He would be the keeper, the guardian of the gate, the man who counted the money. The early days were a blur of rising fame and escalating cash flow. Vernon, a man who once struggled over $4, was now overseeing a financial empire. He moved the family to Memphis, to a series of increasingly comfortable homes, culminating in the white-columned fortress on Highway 51 South, Graceland. It was more than a home. It was a monument to the security he had craved his entire life. And from his small office, he controlled it all. He was meticulous. Every receipt was filed, every expense logged in his precise, steady hand. He was known for his frugality, famously questioning Elvis's lavish spending on cars and gifts for his friends, the entourage that would become known as the Memphis Mafia. To Vernon, these men were parasites, leeches bleeding his son dry. He saw the money flowing out, and it terrified the part of him that still remembered the cold floors of Parchman Farm. But there was a paradox at the heart of Vernon's control. He despised the waste, yet he signed the checks that funded it. He distrusted the entourage, yet he kept them on the payroll. Because to challenge Elvis, to truly say no, would be to risk fracturing the fragile peace he had built. More importantly, it would risk his own position as the sole financial authority. So he watched, he calculated, and he remained silent. Then, in 1955, a new player entered the game, a carnival barker in a businessman's suit named Colonel Tom Parker. The Colonel was everything Vernon was not: loud, ostentatious, a master of the grand spectacle. He saw in Elvis not a son, but a product, an electrifying, once-in-a-lifetime commodity to be managed, marketed, and milked for every last cent. A battle for the soul of Elvis Presley was about to begin, and Vernon found himself in an unholy alliance. At first, Vernon was deeply suspicious of the Colonel. Parker's talk of 50% commissions was anathema to the pathologically frugal Presley patriarch. But the Colonel was smart. He didn't try to push Vernon out. He brought him in. He treated Vernon not as the father of the talent, but as a fellow businessman, a partner. They were the two poles of Elvis's world. The Colonel managed the career, the deals, the image. Vernon managed the money, the home, the reality. Together, they constructed a gilded cage around the king, a world where every decision was made for him, all under the guise of protection. Protection of the asset. And here, in this alliance, we see the first true cracks in the facade of the grieving father. In early 1958, with Elvis about to be inducted into the Army, a lucrative offer came in for a European tour. It would have been a massive payday, and a chance for Elvis to connect with his international fans. The Colonel, a man without a valid passport and a shadowy past he needed to keep buried in Europe, immediately vetoed it. But he needed Vernon's help to sell the lie to Elvis. The Colonel convinced Vernon that a European tour was too risky, that security would be a nightmare, that it was better for Elvis to serve his 2 years as a regular GI to improve his public image. It was a story built on the foundation of control, not care. And Vernon, seeing the logic in protecting the long-term earning potential of the Presley brand, agreed. He helped convince his own son to turn down a dream, not for the son's well-being, but for the manager's convenience and the father's risk-averse business sense. He was no longer just a bookkeeper. He was a collaborator. The silence was becoming strategic. The 1960s rolled on, a monotonous conveyor belt of formulaic Hollywood movies and forgettable soundtracks. The Colonel's strategy was simple: maximum profit for minimum risk. No touring, no controversial music, just a safe, predictable stream of income. And Vernon was there to bank it all. He watched as the creative fire in his son began to dim, replaced by a profound boredom and a growing sense of disillusionment. The money, however, was better than ever. The fortress of Graceland was secure. The ghost of Parchman Farm was kept at bay. But another ghost had taken up residence in the king's palace. Following the death of his beloved mother Gladys in 1958, a deep and inconsolable grief took hold of Elvis. It was a wound that never healed, and it was in this darkness that the pills first appeared: uppers to get through a movie shoot, downers to sleep in a strange hotel room, painkillers for twisted ankles and saddle sores. At first it was manageable, a secret tool of the trade in a demanding industry. But by the 1970s, after the triumphant comeback and the return to live performing, the secret had become a monster. The pressure of being Elvis Presley was immense. The nightly 2-hour explosion of energy on a Las Vegas stage demanded a superhuman price. A price paid for with a cocktail of prescriptions, administered by compliant doctors who were starstruck and handsomely compensated. And every prescription, every doctor's visit, every pharmacy run generated a piece of paper, an invoice, a bill, a check. Every single one of them crossed Vernon Presley's desk. This is where the story turns from one of passive observation to one of active participation. In his little office, surrounded by his ledgers and his adding machines, Vernon saw the evidence in stark black and white. He saw the name of Dr. George Nikopoulos, Dr. Nick, appear with alarming frequency. He saw the receipts from Schwab's pharmacy. He saw the sheer, impossible volume of drugs being ordered. He saw checks for thousands upon thousands of dollars made out directly to the man who was supplying his son with a chemical arsenal. And he picked up his pen, dipped it in the ink, and signed his name. He approved the payments. He balanced the books on his son's destruction. The question is why? Was it a calculated business decision? The cost of keeping the multi-million-dollar Elvis Presley show on the road? A drugged Elvis was still an earning Elvis. A clean Elvis, going through the agony of withdrawal, would mean canceled shows, broken contracts, and a catastrophic loss of income. Did the man who went to prison for $4 look at the river of pharmaceutical cash and decide it was simply a necessary operating expense? Or was it something deeper, more tragic? Was he so paralyzed by the fear of confronting the god his son had become? To challenge Elvis was to risk his rage, to risk being cast out, to lose the one thing he had built his entire life around: his position of control. Perhaps the silence wasn't about money at all. Perhaps it was about fear. The members of the Memphis Mafia would later speak of Vernon's quiet, simmering anger. He would complain about the cost, about the doctors, about Elvis's state. He would shake his head and mutter about the leeches and the hangers-on. But his anger was always directed at the symptoms, never the source. He would argue with a pharmacist over a $10 delivery fee on an order for $5,000 worth of narcotics. He was a man meticulously rearranging deck chairs on a sinking ship. In 1973, David Stanley, Elvis's stepbrother, became so alarmed at the sheer volume of drugs he was picking up for Elvis that he went to Vernon directly. He laid out the pill bottles on the desk, a horrifying display of chemical dependency, and begged his stepfather to intervene. He warned him, point blank, that Elvis was going to die. Vernon listened, his face an impassive mask. According to Stanley, the old man looked at the bottles, looked at his stepson, and said with a chilling finality, There's not a damn thing I can do about it. He's my son, but I can't tell him anything." Then he dismissed him. The conversation was over. The books needed to be balanced. But the story grows darker still, because Vernon wasn't just an employee or a distant manager. He was family, positioned at the very center of the web. And Elvis, whose trust in the outside world had been eroded by fame and paranoia, placed his ultimate faith in his father. In the mid-1970s, Elvis Presley rewrote his last will and testament. He named 2 co-executors to manage his estate after his death: the National Bank of Commerce in Memphis, and his father, Vernon Presley. Suddenly, Vernon's role shifted seismically. He was no longer just the man managing the money of a living superstar. He was now the man who would be in total control of that fortune upon his son's death. Every decision made, or not made, in the twilight of Elvis's life now carried a profound and disturbing conflict of interest. To save his son might mean confronting a demon that could shatter the family and the finances. To remain silent, to continue signing the checks, to let events run their tragic course, ensured a smooth transition of power. The keeper of the king's money was now the heir to the kingdom. Imagine the weight of that knowledge. To sit in that small, quiet office, night after night, hearing the troubled pacing of the man upstairs, the king of rock and roll, a prisoner in his own home. Vernon could see the physical toll, the dramatic weight gain, the slurred speech, the canceled shows that were becoming more and more frequent, each one a stab of financial panic in the old man's heart. He saw doctors come and go at all hours. He saw his own family members, frantic with worry, trying to break through the wall of paid enablers that surrounded Elvis, and they all had to go through him. He held the keys. He signed the paychecks. He was the firewall. One late night, in the summer of 1977, the phone rang. It was one of the nurses, calling from upstairs. Elvis was having trouble breathing. He was disoriented. She was scared. She asked if she should call a doctor or an ambulance. Vernon's voice on the other end was tired, weary, a sound honed by 1,000 similar calls. He told her to wait, to just keep an eye on him. It would pass. It always passed. An ambulance at Graceland would mean reporters, headlines, a scandal that could damage the upcoming tour. It was a financial risk. He hung up the phone. The house fell silent again, except for the hum of the air conditioner and the scratching of his pen against paper. On his desk sat a fresh stack of invoices, one from Dr. Nichopoulos, one for the charter of a private jet to fly in medical supplies. He signs it. The ink bleeds into the paper, a final, dark punctuation mark on a decision made long ago. But what if we've been asking the wrong question all along? What if the tragedy wasn't just that Vernon Presley failed to save his son? What if the most terrifying secret, buried deep in the Graceland archives and the hearts of those who were there, is that, in the end, Vernon Presley had to protect himself from Elvis? To understand this chilling possibility, we have to understand that the Elvis of 1977 was not the same man who had once trusted his father with everything. The paranoia, fueled by drugs and isolation, had curdled into a deep, pervasive suspicion, and that suspicion was beginning to turn inward, toward the very circle of trust he had built. He started asking questions, not just about the sycophants and the girlfriends, but about the money, his money. For 2 decades, the financial arrangement had been simple. Elvis earned it. Vernon managed it. Vernon invested it, paid the bills, handled the payroll. It was a system built on total, patriarchal trust. But in his moments of lucidity, Elvis began to see the cracks. He would complain that he was perpetually short of cash. He, Elvis Presley, the man who could sell out stadiums in minutes, would have to ask his own father for a few $100s. He started making calls, secretive calls to outside accountants, to old friends he hadn't spoken to in years. He wanted to know where it was all going. He was the most famous entertainer on the planet, a one-man corporation, yet he felt like an employee on an allowance, and the person signing that allowance was Vernon. Imagine the terror that would have struck Vernon's heart. This wasn't just an audit. It was a vote of no confidence. It was a potential dethroning. Vernon's entire identity, his power, his very purpose, was tied to his position as the unbreakable financial guardian of the Presley empire. If Elvis brought in outsiders, what might they find? It's easy to assume any irregularities would be grand theft, but the reality was likely more banal and perhaps more insidious. A lifetime of questionable investments, favorable deals for old friends from Tupelo, an inability to say no to his own family members seeking loans, a system of bookkeeping that was more back of the napkin than corporate finance. It wasn't necessarily a criminal enterprise, but it was a house of cards, one built on the premise that the king would never look too closely. And now, the king was starting to look. In 1976, just a year before he died, Elvis took a shocking step. He went to his father and demanded a complete accounting. He wanted to form a new board, bring in professional managers, and modernize the entire operation. He was, in effect, trying to fire his own father from the job that had defined the man's life for 20 years. According to eyewitness accounts from members of the Memphis Mafia, the confrontation was brutal. Elvis accused his father of keeping him in the dark. Vernon accused his son of being an ungrateful, drug-addled child who couldn't be trusted with his own checkbook. He threw Elvis's lifestyle back in his face. The cars, the jewelry, the impulsive gifts, painting it as the sole reason for any financial strain. It was a classic deflection. He made Elvis believe that the problem wasn't the management, but his own uncontrollable spending. He shamed him. He belittled him. And in Elvis's weakened, drug-dependent state, it worked. The rebellion flickered and died. Elvis retreated upstairs, back to the chemical fog, and Vernon remained in control. But the threat had been made. The seed of doubt was planted. This is where the conflict of interest mentioned in Elvis's will becomes so profoundly disturbing. It wasn't just about inheriting control. It was about preventing the loss of control while Elvis was still alive. Every pill drive Nick prescribed, every enabler who kept Elvis sedated and distracted, wasn't just feeding an addiction. They were inadvertently running a defense for Vernon Presley. A clear-headed Elvis was a threat to the status quo. A lucid Elvis might call those accountants back. A sober Elvis might rewrite his will again, and this time, name a bank, and only a bank, as executor. Think of the terrible calculus. Every canceled show was a financial disaster. But a completed tour meant a healthier, more alert Elvis returning home with a pocket full of cash and a renewed sense of his own power. Which was the greater risk? A short-term financial loss, or the permanent loss of everything? The silence, the refusal to intervene, suddenly looks less like parental paralysis and more like a desperate, high-stakes strategy of containment. The final tour was scheduled to begin on August 17, 1977. The pressure was immense. The machine had to keep moving. In the days leading up to it, Elvis was in terrible shape. He was barely sleeping, his moods were erratic, and his health was visibly failing. He made a late-night visit to his dentist for a temporary crown. The dentist, concerned by what he saw, prescribed codeine painkillers. He gave them not to Elvis, but directly to the entourage, with explicit instructions on the dosage. Hours later, in the dead of night, Elvis's girlfriend, Ginger Alden, found him unconscious on the floor of his bathroom. Panic erupted. But who was the first person they called? Not 911. They called the head of security, who then called Vernon's office. For a few critical minutes, the entire tragic scene was funneled through the one man whose world stood to be shattered or solidified by what happened next. When the ambulance finally arrived, it was chaos. But Vernon was a rock of calm. As paramedics frantically worked on his son on the upstairs floor, Vernon Presley was allegedly downstairs, already making calls. Not to family, but to the tour promoter, to the venues, to the pilots. The priority was clear. Control the scene, control the narrative, control the fallout. Later that day, at Baptist Memorial Hospital, the doctors delivered the news. Elvis was gone. Witnesses in the waiting room described Vernon's reaction not as a raw explosion of grief, but as a quiet, heavy collapse. A man finally crushed by the weight he had carried. But as the shock wore off, his instincts, honed by decades of crisis management, took over. Before the world even knew the king was dead, Vernon was already thinking about the kingdom. He returned to Graceland, which was now a crime scene, surrounded by a sea of grieving fans and ravenous media. He walked past the wailing family members, past his own inconsolable mother, and went straight to his office. He locked the door. He had to secure the books. He had to secure the cash that was always kept on hand. He had to secure the will, because he knew what was in that will. He knew that as of that moment, he, Vernon Presley, a man who started life in a two-room shack in Mississippi, was the sole executor of one of the greatest fortunes ever assembled in entertainment history. The questions stopped. The threat of an audit was gone. The potential for being fired by his own son had vanished. In the midst of the greatest personal tragedy of his life, Vernon Presley had also achieved his ultimate victory. Absolute, uncontested control. The tragic irony is that this control would ultimately be his undoing. The burden of managing the chaotic, debt-ridden estate in the aftermath of Elvis's death, dealing with lawsuits, the IRS, and Colonel Tom Parker, would take a heavy toll on his already fragile health. It was a kingdom he had fought to control, but one he was not equipped to rule. He had spent his life managing the money of a living god. But managing the legacy of a dead icon was a different battle entirely, and it was a battle he was destined to lose. But what if the war for Elvis's legacy wasn't just fought on spreadsheets and in courtrooms? What if the most desperate fight Vernon ever waged was to control not just the money, but the truth itself? The truth of how his son really died. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest. Simple, clean, tragic, but not shameful. But behind the scenes, a storm was brewing. The medical examiner, Jerry Francisco, faced immense pressure. An overdose verdict would tarnish the image, invalidate life insurance policies, and invite federal investigations. Who was applying that pressure? All roads lead back to the one man with the most to lose from a scandal, the executor. Did Vernon Presley, in the fog of his grief, orchestrate one of the most significant cover-ups in music history? He had spent decades cleaning up Elvis's messes, protecting the golden goose from itself. Was this just the final, most monumental cleanup job? To bury the truth of the king's death along with his body, sealing the tomb not just on a life, but on a terrible, inconvenient secret. The secret that the kingdom he now controlled was built on a foundation of lies. A secret that someone, somewhere, still knew. But what if the most dangerous secret Vernon uncovered that night wasn't in the autopsy report at all? What he found inside wasn't a ledger. It wasn't a stash of hidden cash or a secret will. It was a bundle of letters, bound with a simple rubber band, and a stack of faded Polaroid photographs. He flicked through the pictures first. His face, already a mask of grief, hardened into something else entirely. Something cold, something unrecognizable. They weren't photos of wild parties or illicit drug use. He'd seen plenty of that. This was different. This was a secret kept not with the family, but from the family. A secret Elvis had carried alone. Then, he read the letters. The handwriting was not his son's. It was a cruel, precise script, demanding, threatening. It spoke of exposure, of ruin. It mentioned names, dates, and places Vernon didn't recognize. And it demanded money. Staggering sums of money, paid in untraceable cash, delivered to drop points across the country. Suddenly, it all made sense. The inexplicable cash shortages, the frantic, late-night phone calls Elvis would take in private, the sudden, dark moods that had nothing to do with the pressures of fame. His son hadn't just been spending a fortune, he was being bled dry. The king wasn't just a prisoner of his own fame. He was the hostage of an unknown enemy. Who was doing this? Who had been torturing his son in silence for years? In that moment, in the locked office at the heart of Graceland, Vernon Presley's mission changed. This was no longer just about preserving an estate. It was about avenging a son. The grief was still there, a cold stone in his gut. But now it was wrapped in a layer of ice-cold fury. The kingdom he had just inherited wasn't just a collection of assets and properties. It was a weapon, and he was now the only man who could wield it. But how do you hunt a ghost? The letters were postmarked from a dozen different cities. There was no return address. The demands were a dead end. Vernon was a bookkeeper, not a detective. He knew numbers, not clandestine warfare. But he had one advantage. He now controlled the entire Elvis Presley machine. The security teams, the lawyers, the private investigators who were once on the payroll to keep the press away and handle paternity suits. They all answered to him now. His first call wasn't to the police. That was unthinkable. This secret had to remain buried deeper than his own son. An investigation would unearth everything, destroying the very image he was now tasked with protecting. No. This had to be handled internally, quietly. He summoned Joe Esposito and the other senior members of the Memphis Mafia, not as grieving friends, but as employees. He interrogated them. Did Elvis ever mention owing someone money? Did he ever travel to a strange location, meet someone in secret? Did any unfamiliar names ever come up? They told him stories of Elvis's generosity, his wild spending, but nothing that pointed to the systematic extortion detailed in the letters. They were blind. Elvis had kept his darkest secret, even from his closest circle. This only fueled Vernon's resolve. He was alone in this. He retreated back to his office, back to the box. He spread the letters out under the desk lamp, searching for a mistake, a slip-up, a single clue. He lived in that office for days, fueled by coffee and rage, while the world mourned outside his gates. He ignored the pleas of his family, the calls from politicians, the logistics of the funeral. All of it was noise. The only thing that mattered was the ghost in those letters. And then he found it. A watermark, a tiny, almost invisible insignia pressed into the corner of one of the pieces of stationery. It wasn't a standard brand. It was custom, likely from a hotel. But which one? There were thousands. It was a needle in a haystack, but it was the first tangible thread he had. Vernon now had a purpose that transcended grief and finance. It explains his cold demeanor in the days following Elvis's death. The world saw a father strangely detached, consumed with business, but he wasn't managing an estate. He was mobilizing an army. He was planning a war. And it also gave him an ironclad reason to support the official narrative of the cause of death. The cover-up of the overdose wasn't just about protecting Elvis's image from the shame of addiction. It was about something far more critical. He had to keep the police, the feds, and the press away from Graceland. He had to ensure that no one else started digging into Elvis's private life, his finances, his final days. Because if they did, they might not find a drug habit. They might find the blackmail letters. They might find the ghost. And Vernon needed to get to that ghost first. The official cause of death, cardiac arrest, wasn't just a lie to protect a legacy. It was a smokescreen to hide a manhunt. Vernon Presley, the grieving father, had turned Graceland from a home into a headquarters. The king was dead, but the war for his soul had just begun. And at the head of that war was his father, a simple man from Mississippi, who was now methodically turning the entire global enterprise of Elvis Presley into a private intelligence agency with a single, chilling objective: to find the person who tormented his son to death and destroy them. But as he began pulling on that first thread, he had no idea where it would lead. He believed he was hunting a common extortionist. He had no idea it would lead him back to the very beginning of Elvis's career, back to the shadows of the military, and to a name he had not heard in over 20 years. A name that Colonel Tom Parker himself was terrified of. The investigation was swift and silent. Using the full financial and legal power of the estate, Vernon's private team traced the hotel stationery's origins, then cross-referenced guest lists with flight manifests and, most importantly, old military service records from Elvis's time in Germany. The thread led not to a slick con man in a penthouse, but to a quiet, unassuming bungalow in rural Virginia. A ghost in a garden shed. The man's name was Major Winters, retired, U.S. Army Intelligence. Vernon didn't send a team. He went himself. The man who opened the door was gray, thin, and utterly unremarkable, but his eyes held a chilling coldness. The same coldness Vernon now felt in his own heart. There was no denial. Winters calmly invited him in, and over lukewarm coffee in a sterile living room, he laid out the truth. The blackmail wasn't just about money. It was about power. During his service, Elvis hadn't just been a soldier. He'd been an asset, a listening post. His fame gave him access to people and places no ordinary GI could reach. Winters had been his handler, and he had kept records of everything. The major explained that the payments were merely a leash, a way to remind Elvis who still held the reins. Now, with Elvis gone, the money was irrelevant. But the story was more valuable than ever. He planned to sell it. The definitive, secret history of the king. Not as a singer, but as a spy. He wasn't just extorting a memory. He was planning to rewrite history itself, destroying the all-American image Elvis had spent his life building. He believed Vernon, the simple bookkeeper, was powerless to stop him. But he misjudged the man sitting opposite him. Vernon Presley was no longer just a father. He had spent the last week becoming a kingmaker, a general, a spymaster in his own right. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make threats. He simply laid out his own terms. He explained, in the calm, methodical tone of a man reviewing a ledger, exactly how he would use the full, crushing weight of the Elvis Presley enterprise to destroy Winters. Not physically, but utterly. Vernon would fund a counter-narrative so vast and deafening it would drown out any truth Winters tried to tell. He would be painted as a pathetic liar, a parasite trying to profit from a hero's death. He would lose his pension, his home, his name. Vernon Presley would weaponize his son's legacy to erase the major from existence. In the end, he gave the man a choice: a quiet, comfortable life funded by a secret trust, in exchange for every last negative, every document, every recording, and eternal silence, or total annihilation. Days later, a courier delivered a metal footlocker to Graceland. Vernon opened it in his office. It was all there. The entire secret life his son had been forced to live. The source of his pain, his paranoia, the reason he could never truly be free. Vernon hadn't just hunted a ghost. He had met his son's demon and forced it into submission. He had won the war. But now, the terrible truth was his to carry. The secret was no longer in the hands of an enemy. It was in his. He placed the box inside, next to the one containing the first letters. He locked the safe, sealing away the last and darkest of his son's secrets forever. The world would remember the king, the legend, the music. Only Vernon would know the full price of that fame. He was no longer just the protector of an estate. He was the keeper of a soul, a father's final, silent, and most important duty. The story you know is never the whole story. And here, we believe the truth, no matter how complex, is what keeps the legacy alive. To uncover more of the untold tales and ensure the music never dies, subscribe to Forever_Elvis_.